Finally, today, it's appropriate that we talk a little bit about change management. We've talked about trying to change cultures, but that brings with it its own problems and how we make changes. So whether trying to change an organizational culture or just make a new policy, or just make some new rules, or just change the way, quote unquote, we do things, um, change is hard. And as leaders, managing change is a big part of our job. And as officers, it's a big part of our job. And so it's worth taking some time to talk about change management and what that means. So in this discussion, we use what's called Beer's rational approach to organizational change. And Dr. Beer is a professor who studies how organizations change and what happens there. And what we find is that the amount of change that occurs has to overcome, or I should say it differently. In order for change to occur, we have to overcome resistance to change. People, as a general rule, naturally are resistant to change. On a psychological basis, we have a strong need to understand the world around us, to understand our place in it. And when change occurs, uh, it can be jarring and it can ruin that understanding. And so it's really important, and that can cause us then to resist change. So as leaders, if we want to change things, we need to overcome people's just innate resistance to it. Now, one option is just order people to do it. And that might be great. And that may work if you use a lot of legitimate power to do it. But that's really going to chip away at any other source of social power that you have. And ultimately, you will end up with a lot of compliance and not a lot of commitment to the way you want things to be. And so we can use Beer's rational approach model to give us some ideas about the sorts of things that you want to pay attention to when you're looking to overcome resistance to change. One is to take a look at the dissatisfaction with the current status quo. Another is to look at having a model for change, what you want, what your vision is of what the world will look like when you're done changing, and then a process for getting through the change, how we get from where we are now to where you want to be in that model, and then what happens to resistance over time. And all of that will lead to the amount of change. And yes, I 100% recognize that you can't have an equal sign and a greater than sign in a quote unquote equation. But this is more about getting across ideas than it is about plugging some numbers into it. I want you to conceptually understand this idea. And so let's walk through what some of these things mean. So we talk about dissatisfaction. We have to understand how our followers see the status quo. And oftentimes the followers are perfectly happy with the status quo. And so if we want change, and particularly change that may not directly benefit the followers or requires action or effort on their part, we need to describe for them the need for change. What are the threats that are out there that bring about the need for this change? What are the environmental changes? What are the internal challenges? Do we have a broken system? Are there threats? Are there opportunities that we want to take advantage of? Is there something that's not working that we could be doing better? All of these things, again, it's about explaining the why and not just determining that a change is needed. But to explain to people why the change is needed. You need to communicate that change, because the response is often going to be, well, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Or, and this is a phrase you will hear often in the military, oh, you're just trying to change for the sake of change. And these are things that you want to avoid. Certainly we want to don't just not change because nobody likes change, but you need to explain why we are bringing about the change. What's wrong with the current system that's going to that requires this change, whatever it may be. And then we need to create a model. And the model here is the vision of what things will look like after change occurs. And then the process is how we're going to get to that change. So again, the model is that vision. This involves new goals and a new system, maybe a new organizational structure or process, new SOPs. What does this all look like when we're done? That's really going to help people to understand what needs to happen and why change is so important. If you can explain to them, this is what this looks like when we're done. And then, of course, this is how we're going to get there. Goals, deliverables, timelines, accountability, resources for how we're going to get from A to B. If you don't provide that, again, you're inviting chaos and you're inviting a lack of understanding, and it's going to make it really hard for people to bring about this change. One thing I'd like to point out in our pseudo equation here is the idea of dissatisfaction times model times process. The reason it's multiplicative is because if any one of these goes to zero, the whole thing gets shot and it's really hard for us to make change. So you may have an awesome vision and you may have the perfect plan for how to get there. But if nobody wants to change, if nobody is unhappy, if everybody's happy with the current state of affairs, boy, it's going to be really hard to bring about change. Uh, or people may have a real problem with the status quo and may really buy into your vision of how things ought to be. But if they don't know the process for how we're going to get there, and if there's not a good process for getting there, that's going to be a problem. And the same thing, they may want to change. They may believe in whatever process you have, but they don't know where they're going. And if they don't really have an idea of the vision, that's going to be problematic. So we need to help people to understand and inform our own understanding of what the status quo is and what the need for change is. We need to have a clear explication of what the vision is when we're done with change. And we have a clear idea of what the process is for getting there. And all this needs to come over resistance. And people have a natural reaction to change that follows this model, the Sarah model: shock, anger, rejection, and then finally acceptance. Kind of like the stages of grief, this is how people react to change. So whether you're just changing the way that you're going to do your meetings each week, or changing the battle rhythm, or you're going to change the uniforms of the service, or you're going to change some major organizational aspect, or whatever, people are going to go through this. Now, the level of shock may have a lot to do with how well you explain all those other things and how well you bring about the change. But you can expect at least some sort of shock to go in there. What I really want to get across here, I think this idea of shock, anger, rejection, and acceptance is fairly intuitive, and I think most of you will recognize that process. But what I really want to get across here is how different leaders are at different points in this curve as the change is implemented. So when the leader first comes out, when the change first comes out and gets promulgated to senior leaders, they will go through this shock and anger and maybe rejection. And then as they start to accept it, they in turn are going to implement it. Well, now let's look at the most junior folks. As the implementation starts, now the most junior folks are in this point of shock and anger and rejection, while the leaders are saying, why can't you just accept the change, even though they went through that same process themselves? So oftentimes, for instance, a company officer may be upset about a certain change that needs to be made. They may go through their own shock, anger, and rejection process, and ultimately they accept it, and they move on, and they start trying to execute it. Then they turn around, they talk to their company commander and their company XO and the company first sergeant about what's going to happen. And then those midshipmen go through the same process of shock and anger and rejection, while the company officer's in an acceptance phase and maybe starting to get upset about why everybody's so angry about it. And then that command triad of the company will go through this acceptance phase and start ready to implement things. And they'll start explaining to the classes and to the members of the company, okay, here's the change that's coming down. And again, those midshipmen then are going to go through this shock and anger and rejection moment while their leaders are in this acceptance moment. This mismatch can cause real frustration on both parts, as the leaders just don't understand why the followers are in this phase, and the followers don't understand why the leaders are so accepting of this change. So as you bring about change, you need to, one, understand the status quo and communicate well about the need for change. Two, you need to communicate about the vision for what change finally looks like. And again, we've talked about shared leadership. That doesn't mean you need to dictate the vision. That may be as simple as asking people to come on board and help you create that vision. And that's a great way to communicate what the final vision is. And then you need to communicate about the plan to get there. And again, pulling people in to be part of that planning process can be part of the communication and getting people to overcome their resistance to change by participating in the process. And then you need to understand that at an emotional, affective level, people are going to be in different places with respect to the change. You need to respect that, and you need to communicate that up and down the chain of command.